Okay. Come on in, Ryan. So this is the Palazzo Capponi. It was built in the first decade of the 15th century by a Renaissance Florentine banker by the name of Niccolo Duzzano, who is mostly remembered for the portrait that Donatello sculpted of him. And when he died in the 1420s, the Capponi family bought the building, and they still live here today. 600 years later, the Count and Countess Capponi are my landlords upstairs, and they have been supporting art since the Renaissance. Pontormo's deposition, for instance, they commissioned from Pontormo, still hangs in their family chapel in a church just down the street.
I'm Ryan Brown, and this is the Unvarnished podcast, and I'm in Florence, Italy, and I saw Dan Graves, I guess, a week and a half ago, and he said, he mentioned you, and he's like, oh, he's got a podcast, and you should check it out. He's great. He's really like a big fan of yours, and
It's mutual.
yeah. And so I went home and I listened to 3 or 4 episodes yesterday, and I'm just cannot believe I hadn't heard of you before. I mean, I was so unbelievably impressed. Did I say your name?
Thank you.
I said I'm in Florence.
I don't think so.
Sorry.
Hi,
I'm in Florence, and I'm with Jason Arkles in his Florence studio, sculpture studio. You're a sculptor, a podcaster, an author. Your podcast is called The Sculptor's Funeral.
You got it.
And you can find it at sculptorsfuneral.com. And I was just kind of blown away by it. I couldn't stop listening to it yesterday. I was painting in the apartment, and it's just so good.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Your storytelling, the way you're putting pieces together, and the way you kind of like paint this picture of what was going on and who the artists were and the motivations and social issues and all of that is such it's such a brilliant podcast. And
Thank you. Thanks.
that actually reminded me, we were talking earlier at the table, and I was talking about another artist and what he was talking about. It just reminded me of the point I was trying to make, which was oftentimes we talk about art history in terms of this art historian's perspective, which
Right.
is here's the art that was made and here's the money that was involved and blah, 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 but not necessarily in terms of what the artist had for lunch or what his studio conditions were like or what kind of social pressures he may have had or what kind of financial struggles he may have had or, frustrations with a girlfriend or like there's so much that we're involved with as artists that necessarily has an effect on what we create that doesn't make it into the art history books. Mm. And I feel like when I was listening to your podcast, it does that thing that I have always missed when I read the art history books or take an art history class, which is it puts me in touch with the artist on a personal level.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And that's exactly what I, try to do with the podcast. You're totally 100% right that, art history isn't names and dates. It's not really about that. If you don't understand why a sculpture was made, why it was made in the way it was, you won't understand anything about art history at all because it's not just a litany of who did what. And yes, in terms of approaching it from the point of view of a practitioner, I was a sculptor before I was ever an art historian.
Yeah.
And all I do is, really, as I, research each topic is ask the questions I want to know the answers to.
Yeah.
And of course, that's going to be from a practitioner's point of view quite a bit. Another thing that I thank you for mentioning is the sort of narrative aspect, the storytelling, relaying it in a larger context. Before I was ever a sculptor, I was working in theater, right? So I got my start there. And in theater, and I did acting for a little bit, but I quickly migrated into everything, but acting or directing and writing quite a bit. And the thing about theater is, once the play is over with, there's nothing left. There's no artifact.
Yeah.
And so if you don't make the person understand the point that you're trying to get across during the show, then the show isn't worth doing.
Yeah.
Right. And I bring that ethos into my sculpture and into the practice of art history in terms of storytelling and making it an understandable, relatable human story. Because after all, these artists were just humans. Even, the great Michelangelo, the first episode I ever did on Michelangelo, I think I called it Michelangelo, Man and Myth. And the first thing I wanted to do, because there's so many sort of tall tales about Michelangelo, is break those down.
Yeah.
He wasn't divine. He wasn't immaculate. He made mistakes. And the higher a pedestal you put someone like Michelangelo upon, the farther away you put them from yourself. And so I try to make it human and digestible and relatable, because the struggles that, so many sculptors, when you read their early histories of all the lengths they had to go through to get trained or to get recognized, they're mirrored with the sculptors of today. We're going through the same problems. We don't have it. We don't have it much worse than they did. They did have it better in a lot of fundamental ways. Depending on your, period of time. But we are the next chapter of art history. I say that a couple times in the podcast. It's not, art history isn't something that happened in the past. It's a continuum.
Right. Sure.
And the part you play in the next chapter is up to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are some good art podcasts. I don't. I'm kind of on and off with podcasts, just because
you got stuff to do.
Well, I like to listen to it when I paint. It's just, it keeps me at that easel. I just find that it almost puts me in a state where I almost paint a little bit more free, because I'm not overanalyzing things. My mind is engaged in thinking about whatever philosophy or whatever it is that I'm listening to. And there's a separate part of my mind that's engaged in the act of painting. Yeah. And I feel like I talked to my wife about this a little bit. I feel like there's two parts of our brain. There's this sort of childish part that wants to be entertained constantly, that needs some sort of constant distraction. Mm-hmm. And then there's the part of our brain that's the adult that needs to get shit done. And I feel like going for a walk is so therapeutic, because especially if you're going for a walk in the woods. For me, I love that, because the childish part of your brain is looking at all the little beauties, and there's all these little dazzling, the stream, rolling over the rocks, and the leaves coming down, and the light streaming through the trees and whatever. I feel like there's some sort of visual distraction that takes up this part of my brain that allows me to be really concentrated and work through more serious problems just by being on the walk. And I feel like the same in painting. Like, the adult part of my brain can take care of that if I have this distraction that allows me to think about other things. And when it starts to get too heavy philosophically, or I almost have to stop painting and like pull over here and think about it. So I'm kind of back and forth. But
yeah, I understand. I actually can't listen to music while I work from models generally. When I'm carving marble, I got not music, but I mean, I'm a podcast junkie.
Yeah.
Which is why I actually did a podcast rather than a YouTube channel or whatever. Just because I know there are a lot of other artists who do the same thing. Do exactly what you're describing. But I can't even certainly music with lyrics I can't listen to while I'm working.
Interesting.
And I also don't want to let the music affect my mood as I work. I don't want my work to be a record of what I was listening to that day.
Interesting.
And so I would rather have it, be, not to get sort of highfalutin about it, but sort of a more pure dialogue of just between myself and the model, my reaction, and action with the model, rather than sort of having, outside influences that put me in a somber mood because I was listening to Mozart's Requiem or, But when I'm carving marble, sweeping floors, casting, mold making, all the technical stuff, which of course is like 90% of sculpture, then yeah, headphones on,
Yeah.
podcasts.
Yeah, for me, it's if I do listen to music, I always want it to be music that I know the lyrics to and can sing to.
Right.
Because I'm in my best painting state when I'm not thinking about painting. In an odd way. There's something about almost the intuitive part of my mind taking over and just sort of freely. I mean, I would say in the bulk of the painting, not in the most complex areas where I've got to like slow down and be very careful about, small specific areas or turning form or those areas that are super delicate. But in that sense, I probably do turn the music off. But yeah, it's just I've realized that there's like these two parts of my brain that want to be entertained in different ways, and one is a very concentrated thing, and the other is just frivolous almost. So podcasts have been great for me. Books on tape, mindless TV series on Netflix that I don't actually have to watch.
Really,
as much.
you'll put on something like Netflix while you're painting.
If it's like something I've already seen, maybe like Peaky Blinders or something.
Wow, it sounds like you really need a distraction.
Almost, yeah.
I find
weird.
distractions distracting.
Yeah, yeah. It's weird. Maybe I'm
No,
ADD or something.
No,
I don't know, but
if it gets the job done,
yeah,
I'm a pragmatist.
I think that your podcast is certainly one of the most intriguing that I've found. Even just the timbre of your voice. I mean, it is storytelling.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's so. I just really enjoy it. And I only listened to like 3 or 4 yesterday, so I'm
You got some catching up to do.
I do. I'm excited to be here. I'm grateful like you had the time to let me in, and I'd love to find out more about you. So I don't know if you want to start at the beginning.
Sure. I love the fact that you actually don't know who I am.
Yeah.
So because like
I'm a
usually
blank
with
slate.
interviews, people say, so where did you get your start? And they already know how I got my start, sort of thing, So that's great. So ask away.
Yeah,
Let's
I
make
mean,
this
I'm interested
spontaneous.
in where you came from. You mentioned theater at first. That's really interesting to me because of the storytelling aspect and the idea, especially directing. I feel like painting has a lot to do with that. You're sort of directing all of these different elements that you're trying to allow to play their part.
A lot of moving parts in theater.
Yeah,
it's one of the things I didn't like about it.
Well, it's one of the things that I talk about with designing paintings. And even just if you want to break it down to a simple like academic nude or something, you have to understand that every part of the drawing, every part of the painting has a part to play. And if you're trying to create a scene in a movie where these two main characters are maybe going to get back together after they've broken up and they're meeting after several months in an outdoor cafe at Paris, you have to have the cars driving by. You have to have people eating at the tables behind them. You have to have all of these players playing their part. But if the person 4 tables back starts doing jumping jacks, you lose the plot of the scene. And so it's the same in making a well-balanced drawing or a well-balanced painting. Every part has a certain voice that it's supposed to have. And if it gets too loud, it gets too distracting. You lose the oneness of effect.
It's called unity of sentiment.
Yes.
Unity of sentiment.
I'm gonna use that from now on.
Joseph Jacotot. We'll talk about that off screen or whatever. That's a rabbit hole to go down, but I might mention him a little bit later. But he's been big in my thinking in recent years.
Yeah, it's very, very, very difficult to do in painting, to have a oneness of effect, or what did you say?
Unity of sentiment.
Unity of sentiment. Even in a simple landscape or even just a singular portrait, it's very difficult to create that unified effect and have every part play its role. So it's interesting to me that you have that writing background, the acting background, the director background, and art history background, because even that is following a story arc of the history of development of painting and architecture and sculpture. And And so, yes, I'm all anything you want to share about your history, where you came from, how long, what brought you to Florence, how did you find Charles Cecil, why Charles Cecil versus something else, I'm interested in all of that.
This is going to be a long podcast episode.
All right, let's do it.
So, my journey into art was a bit unorthodox. I came to Florence thinking I was going to be here for 5 days. I was not looking for an art school. I was not thinking at all about studying art. I was traveling around Europe as a street performer. In theater, back in the United States, I had gotten pretty heavily involved in puppetry, and I was really interested in a fairly deep way, the art of puppetry. And I found out about a school in France that is the best school in the world for puppeteers. And it's a very elite school. They only allow 15 students in every 3 years. It's a 3-year program. So they'll take in one group and focus on them until they graduate, then take in another group.
Wow.
They have an age cutoff of 26, and I was 23, 24 at the time. And so I had one shot. So I took a year off of everything I was doing, studied French, put together an audition, went to Paris, was in Paris for a week, was in Charleville-Mézières, this little town in sort of the Ohio of France, for a week where I auditioned. I didn't make it. Obviously, I didn't make it into the school. And I was dejected, and I was looking for a consolation prize, I think. I didn't want to go back to North Carolina and just sort of pick up where I left off the year before I started preparing for this whole ordeal. And in Paris, I was living in a bookstore at the time, Shakespeare and Company, and there were half dozen other people living there as well, and that's kind of a story in itself. But one of the people there was a street performer who was very successful, and she invited me to spend the summer traveling with her and about a half dozen other street performers all around Europe doing sort of a street circus. And that sounded great. I always wanted to try a street performance, but I knew unless I sort of put myself into the position where I had to do it, I would never really, get the courage to do it. So this seemed like a good opportunity. And I was miserable. I was miserable at it. Street theater, it operates on a different mode than regular theater, where people are actually expecting to see a spectacle and paying money to see that spectacle rather than just trying to, get back to their car or whatever. And so I was not, I had no understanding of the form, what it comes down to. And so I was miserable. I was eating out of garbage cans eventually. We were all over France, down the Riviera into Nice, and then we were like, okay, Italy, where are we going to go? And everyone's like, oh, we got to go to Venice. That's going to be sort of Mecca for street performers. And one person in our group said, well, actually, I have this brother who lives in Florence, goes to this weird little art school something. If we go to Florence, perhaps we could sleep indoors and take showers. And so we're like, well, we're going to Florence. And so I arrive in Florence, and this guy's brother was a studio assistant for Charles Cecil.
Wow.
And that's how I was introduced to this art school. He'll be mad if he hears me calling it an art school. It's an atelier.
And this was in like
1996.
Wow.
1996.
So
back in the old days, before the internet. You couldn't find out about it.
You couldn't find out about it,
No,
right.
yeah.
And this was after the three broke up?
Yeah, well,
the two broke up.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so it was after the Cecil Graves School split. That was in, I think, 89.
Oh.
So this is 96.
Wow,
this is several years
earlier
after.
than I thought.
I think they were together from 81 to 89.
Okay.
Maybe 90. Anyway, so I walked into this place, and when I saw the caliber of work that the students were creating, even the first-year students, I was absolutely blown away. Again, this is before the internet. You couldn't find out about people doing this. And I remember having gone into a museum with my family and asking my dad in front of a marble statue, how's that made? My dad's a pretty handy guy. He's a woodworker and that sort of thing. He's like, I have no idea. And, you look at the little tags on the walls, and they were made 100 years ago or 400 years ago. And I was just like, oh, this is just something humans don't do anymore.
Right.
We lost the ability or lost the interest or something,
Yeah.
Now art is, modern, abstract, and conceptual. And, I wasn't against it. I just wasn't interested in it. I never took a single art class in high school. Never. And when I walked in, and it was a paradigm shift. I realized, oh, this is a possibility. You could live a life like this, and it was a true epiphany. I changed my life that day. I decided, okay, well, if I'm going to starve to death somewhere, I'm going to do it in Florence, the most beautiful city I've ever seen.
Wow.
And fortunately, it was right at the time that Charles Cecil was talking about putting together a sculpture department. So Charles Cecil is a painter, and he had put on the door of his studio, Charles H. Cecil Studios, I think it's drawing, painting, sculpture. And he always wanted to include it in some way. And finally, he was making moves to do this. And it just so happens that this studio assistant, whose brother I had spent the summer traveling around with, was being put in charge of an experimental sculpture department. Just a small room off to the side, sort of in the basement, could fit maybe half a dozen students. And it was an experimental sculpture department because Charles Cecil wanted to see if he could revive the sight size method of sculpture. And so sight size is probably very familiar to your audience and to you, right? It's how we do cast drawings. It's how we learn draftsmanship. It's how portraits are painted generally. You know, there are certainly lots of other methods, but this is a pretty good one, especially for portraits. It's got a storied tradition going back either to the 18th century or to the 15th century, depending on who you ask. But most of all, it's not a drawing technique. It's not a painting technique. It's an observational technique.
Yeah.
And there's tons of anecdotal information that it was a popular technique in 19th century, especially in France, as a sculpting, a clay modeling technique. And he wanted to sort of revive that. What Charles didn't want to do is hire someone who knew how to sculpt, because they would inevitably sort of taint the purity of sight size by bringing in, techniques and this and that of another method. And so he was going to sort of, home grow it. Sam, the studio assistant, he was the studio handyman. So, okay, you're good with power tools. Okay, you're now a sculptor, sort of thing. He knew he was a painter. He knew sight size and everything. And then I come in, and I'm just casting about for any way to be connected to the school. Of course, I don't have any money to go to this school. So I'm like, can I pose? Can I work as a model? Oh, sure. And I was able to sell myself to Charles and to Sam as a studio assistant's assistant, because I knew casting and mold making from my theater days as a prop master and a puppet maker, right? So I knew tons of technical processes. Is that me?
I don't know. Can you hear that?
A little bit, yeah. Can you hear that, audience? What is that?
What is that? What's going on here? Sorry.
That's all right.
That might be super annoying to...
Oh, yeah, it's definitely you, huh? Yeah.
Okay, might be. Okay.
All right,
Let's
take
try
two.
that again.
Oh, you had it, and then you touched it.
Sorry.
That's all right.
I'll edit this out.
I assumed. Do you do a lot of editing?
Not a lot. It's the worst. It's the worst part of it. I try to have it be just as seamless as possible. I edit in some B-roll of the studio stuff for the visual. But beyond that, okay.
All right. Don't touch it.
Don't touch.
Don't touch it.
All right.
So where should I roll back to?
So you had experience with the mold making, whatever.
Yes. So because of my experience in theater, I knew casting and mold making. I knew clay and tools, plaster, that sort of thing. I knew nothing about art. And so I became part of the experimental first class.
Crazy timing. It's just so
I know.
crazy.
No, I was right time, right place.
What's also interesting is how militant it sounds like Charles was about specifically sight size.
I wouldn't say militant. I would say
insistent. Maybe is the right word.
Well, I mean, that's all he teaches. That's all he teaches. You see, Charles Cecil Studio, it is not, he calls it a studio because it's not an academy, right? It is, he's a single master. He has never had more. I think one time he's like, oh, let's see how big I can get. And he had about 50, 60 students at one point, and he just decided he didn't like that. And so he shrunk the school back down to, somewhere between 25 and 35. And it's been like that since forever.
Yeah.
And that's how he likes it, right? If you want to be a portrait painter in oils, it is one of the best places to learn the technique for that. I think he is a consummate teacher. I really do. If you want to learn anything else, you're better off going somewhere else. And I think Charles would probably agree with that as well.
Yeah.
So he's got his thing. He doesn't teach broadly, but he teaches very deeply.
Sure.
Right. Tom Richards, who now runs, he's the artistic director of Florence Academy. He was a Charles Cecil student.
Yeah.
He was a Charles Cecil student when I was there. It's a fantastic training, and it's also the ethos he imparts, and also a rigorous standard. You're not comparing yourself this is one of the great things about studying in Florence generally, is that you don't compare yourself to your classmates. You don't compare yourself to your teachers. You compare yourself to the sculpture you walk by every day, John Bologna, Michelangelo, and of course painting is the same way. You hold yourself, consciously or not, to a higher standard than is maybe possible in a place like many places in the United States, simply because the exposure isn't a daily exposure. It's not, it's not looking at art through books. It's living amongst art. And it really has an unquantifiable but absolutely palpable effect.
Do you feel like that effect to some degree hinders people? I've always been curious about the psychology of it. Like when I'm in Paris, there's something about being there that makes me feel like, why am I even fucking trying? Like I walk through the Louvre or the Orsay, and I think like, I can't remember whose quote it was. People say that, I'm going to destroy this quote, but people say that all the narratives in painting have been done, but they have not yet been done by me, something like that. And so I have that part of my brain that's like, you have something valuable to say, you're unique. More than that, you're just interested in it, so do it. But then, walking through the Orsay, there is a part of me that thinks, if I had a studio 20 minutes from here, how much would this psychologically affect me in terms of like how do I live up to it? Of course, there's an inspiration aspect to it, but there's also a discouraging part of it that's like, fuck, it's so good.
I think it's going to be different for different people, because I've never been discouraged by that. I mean, I remember consciously as a first and second year student going, I can't figure out how to do hair. And so I walk around town and go, oh, that's how he did hair. And that's how they did hair. Oh, okay. I think I have a way that I can do hair.
Yeah.
And so I've always found it to be nothing but an encouragement.
Nice.
And, because again, and I think this, again, might be the perspective of living in a place like Florence versus living in the United States, is that it's not as, you get used to it. It's not as up on a pedestal and that was then and this is now, and there's this huge inseparable gulf. The reason I became an art historian, the reason I became passionate about art history, because it wasn't there at the beginning, was I think my second or third year at Charles Cecil. Have you his original studio, not the Piazza Donatello ones, but the one on Borgo San Frediano?
That's the only one I've been in. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So it's an amazing sculpture studio. It's a historic sculpture studio. It was Lorenzo Bartolini's, who died in 1850 and then willed it to his right-hand man, Pasquale Romanelli. And it's still owned by the Romanelli family, and there's now a fifth-generation Romanelli sculptor working in there. And that building is where the very first American who wanted to learn European sculpture came to study. Horatio Greeno, he's the guy that did the bare-chested George Washington statue in the basement of the Smithsonian, if you've ever seen it.
Yeah.
Horatio Greeno was the first native-born American to come to Europe to learn how to do sculpture, and he learned it in the same four walls I learned it.
That is incredible.
And when I sort of internalized that, not just learned it, but really like let it sink in, that's when I knew I'm a part of something bigger than myself.
Yeah.
Art history is not just the past; it is also the future. It is continuing, and I am going to do my damnedest to be some small part of the next chapter. And that's one of the reasons I started the podcast. Is I wanted to give people the resources I wish I had when I started out. Because again, in 1996, you didn't have the internet. You couldn't Google stuff. You couldn't Google image search and, instantly come up with something, or, I want to learn about that sculptor, and you just order the book on Amazon. It took me years to learn what I could probably teach myself in a week.
Yeah.
Just with the internet.
Well, there is something really special to maybe go against what I was saying about maybe being intimidated in some of these cities by the art of the past, and that is the connection you inevitably feel by standing in the same spot that they stood in. There's a road, it's a little road just across the river from here, Via de Brac or something, that Sargent painted. And you can, go stand in the spot. There's several places like that. I know Toby,
I know a couple Tobys. Toby Wright?
Toby Wright, sorry. Yes, duh. Toby Wright has just done like a series where he was kind of like looking for Edward Harrison Compton, Theodore Compton. I don't. Their father, son. He was kind of like looking for places that they, views that they painted in the Alps, and going on kind of these journeys of different artists. But when you're in a city like Florence or Paris or London, and you are you get to walk the streets that they walked, it feels like you are actually in. These are tangible people now, and they're almost friends of yours at this point. Do you know what I'm saying? You get to see their paintings, and there's a personal connection now because they're no longer
doesn't that lessen the
characters
sense of,
on a screen?
Doesn't that lessen the sense of intimidation for you, though?
Absolutely. That's what I was saying. It's to go against what I was saying about intimidation. Yeah. It makes it more tangible, and it makes it feel like I'm a part of this, and it's reachable. It's like these weren't fantasy characters. These were real people with real problems, and they're just like me. And if they could figure it out, I can figure it out. And maybe it's even easier for me because they put a lot of answers on these canvases, right? Like like you said, you can walk around and see how this person dealt with hair, that person dealt with hair, and now I can bring those solutions back and try them and find my own way. I think there's something about living in these cities with so much history that inevitably seeps into your consciousness that I don't feel in the West. I'm not only in America, but I'm in Western America, where everything is new, everything is a strip mall, everything is built to be deconstructed in 30 years and built back up. There's not a lot of history to it, and so there isn't that tangible tie. Mm-hmm. There's a very strong disconnect between the art that I study and the art I'm trying to make because I'm not surrounded by it. And that's why, when I lived here in Florence, I just never felt more inspired or more a part of something than being in the city. So sorry, I'm interrupted you, but
interrupted me saying what?
I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm
talking about my early days, my start.
Yes.
And so.
So perfect timing. They start a sculpture program.
Yeah, and so I'm totally stoked, and I'm also desperate, because I had no money. And when I say I had no money, I arrived in Florence with a little half-liter water bottle, about a third full of coins, because I was making a living, such as it was, as a street performer, and that means change, right? And this was in 1996, before the euro. So I had this little plastic bottle, a third full of French francs, and here I was in Italy. I had no lira. I actually had no spendable money. I met a French student at Charles Cecil and was like, "Can you please just take this so I can have something to eat?" And it was bad, and I didn't want to, now that I had found a place, and now that I'd been like incredibly graciously given a place by Charles. I never paid tuition at Charles Cecil. Well,
Wow.
I never was a student, really. I went from model to model half day, studio assistant half day, for really interesting and gossipy and bizarre personal reasons. That assistant had to leave about 3 months into the sculpture department beginning, and I became the de facto head of the sculpture department.
Wow.
So,
Like, how old were you at
24.
Okay.
24. Just turned 25 when I took over. And it wasn't just all me. It was an experimental class. We were all in it together. But someone needed to sweep the floors and make sure we had clay. And so I was that guy.
So where were your parents here? Were they like supportive of all of this?
Yeah. As much as they knew what I was even doing and going through, I didn't want to, stress them out. And, my parents have always been, very, supportive of whatever I'm doing. I could sell drugs and they'd be like, "Well, as long as you're happy." And I mean, not that bad, but it's fine. And I think they knew that if I was ever in real trouble, I could ask for help and maybe they would give it, if they could. And, but I never got that desperate. Looking back, I did some crazy, I made some unwise decisions, risky decisions, but it all worked out, thankfully. I could have ended up, in a gutter, literally.
Yeah.
But the school, Charles Cecil's school, saved me. It gave me something to do all day. I ended up renting a closet to live in for the first year.
How did you do it in terms of just legally living here?
So this is the 90s, man.
Right. This is before.
Yeah.
It got really tight.
It was before the EU really started to coalesce. It was before Schengen, right? So the Schengen Agreement is where you can travel without a visa from here to France, right? Or, most places in the EU. So this is before that agreement where every country ran its own borders and everyone had different rules. And Italy, the lira in the 90s was crap, and the 90s dollar was amazing. And so they didn't mind. And this is what, this is how I started out here. I would be in Florence for 2 years, and I would go through customs on the way out, or, passport control. They would look at my passport and they say, you've been here for 2 years without a visa? I would say, "Yes, sir." And they would say, "Come back soon." And they'd hand me the passport.
Wow.
Because they had just assumed I was bringing American dollars with me.
Yeah.
And that started to tighten up, obviously, with the Schengen, with 9/11, with the euro. And so around 2002 was probably the last time I sort of flagrantly overstayed my visa. And then I worked it out where I would go back and forth. And by then I was like a big boy now. So I'm a real life sculptor. I'm going to open up a studio in North Carolina. And I did that sort of for 4 years. But every year I found an excuse to come back to Florence for 3 months a year, 6 months a year on a tourist visa.
Yeah.
But still working for Charles. I mean, volunteering at Charles. I wasn't, working under the table or anything like that. Don't ever say that. But after a while, it was bad. I was just back and forth, and I would lose momentum wherever I was, and I realized I just couldn't live this double life anymore. And so one day in 2006, so 10 years on in my journey, I'm 34 now, and I go out one Saturday night with my students, who are all a decade younger at least than me, out to a nightclub. I got too drunk. I woke up hungover. I was just lying there, cold sweat sort of thing, feeling so sorry for myself, going, I can't do this. I'm 34. I need to figure out my life. I just can't come over here and, piddle around, even though it's what I want to do is just be here. I need to figure out, where I need to be and what I need to do. I'm lying there in bed, and I started thinking about a conversation I had had a couple weeks previously with another studio assistant at Charles, who was British, and she was going back to the UK. And I approached her. I said, I would like to get your flat. She had this huge flat, big enough to live in and have a sculpture studio. So maybe if I just make a studio, I'll suddenly magically become legal. And so I, wanted to sort of plant roots down here in some way. And she said, well, they're kind of kicking everybody out of the building because they're going to be redoing the entire building, top to bottom, inside and out, new roof, new plumbing, that sort of thing. Now, this building, Renaissance Palazzo, but in the bottom floor is St. Mark's English Church. It's an Anglican church built in the 1880s into this palazzo to serve the needs of the Grand Tour and the expatriate community here. And the church owned the entire building, and the flats were above the church. And the building had just fallen into a state of disrepair after decades of neglect, and they had somehow raised a bunch of money. Now, when this church got built into this pre-existing palazzo, they're like, oh, let's make a sort of a churchy facade. And so they put, very sort of modest, just a single niche above the main doors of the church on the facade. And then they found out about a law in Tuscany, or perhaps in all of Italy, that if you were not Roman Catholic, you could not proselytize, and that included decorating the facades of your house of worship, even though Anglicanism is about as close as you can get.
Yeah.
Right? And so they built this niche and they left it empty. And so as a first or second year student, I noticed this very prominent empty niche in the center of Florence. And I fantasized about being the sculptor to make a sculpture for this niche. I even, as a second year student, just took one of my figure studies and I made it into a St. Mark. I put a little lion next to his foot and that sort of thing. I said, just fantasizing. If I had this commission, how would I approach it? Sort of thing. Fast forward 9 years. I'm lying in bed hungover, and I'm like, screw it. If they're going to spend all this money on redoing this church, maybe they're going to put something in that niche. So I sort of slunk out of bed and grabbed my portfolio, went down to church, all pale and sweaty and shaky, and I arrived too late for the mass. It was over, but I had been there a few times before. It's kind of one of the social centers of English-speaking Florence. And I knew they did coffee upstairs in the salone. And so I go up there, and even that's just about over. There's like 3 people left, and one of them's the chaplain. And I go up and I introduce myself as, hey, I'm Jen's friend. I wanted her flat. And he's like, oh, yeah, she told me about you. Well, come back in a couple of years when it's going to be a luxury flat, and then you can rent it for 5 times the price.
Right.
And I said, well, that sounds great. I'm sure I'll do that. But what I really want to do is talk to you about something. And he kind of looks at me, in sort of the pastoral way. Please step into my office, son. And thinking I'm going to confess to a murder or something maybe. and I tell him, I say, listen, I've been looking at that niche for 9 years. And for 9 years, I've been wanting, I want to be the person to sculpt a marble figure of St. Mark for that niche. And he kind of sort of starts. And he says, I've been chaplain here for 5 years. And since I've arrived, I've been telling people we need to find a sculptor to make a marble statue of St. Mark. Can you do altars as well? And I'm like, yeah, I do altars all the time. Sure, I can do an altar. And so I walked out of that meeting with 2 commissions, one for a statue and one for an altar for a side chapel inside the church. And that was what put me on the trajectory to, getting legal here. And I'm the only American, living or dead, to have a permanent marble figure on the facade on the cityscape of Florence.
Wow,
yeah.
That's incredible.
It doesn't hurt to ask.
Yeah, I have found that to be constantly true.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want something, I think we're so, paralyzed often by why would they want me to do it, or that's never a possibility, or whatever excuse we have to not ask. Mm-hmm. But I've always found that no doesn't it doesn't hurt. And oftentimes it's a yes. And I found that to be very true. Anything you want, you should always be willing to go for it and ask that. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic one, though. That's pretty amazing. All on the inspiration of booze.
Well, I don't know if I would call it the inspiration of booze, or catalyst, perhaps, the precipitate.
No, I mean, it's cool because what you were looking for was not just, I mean, you had this thing, but you kept coming back to Florence, and you were looking for, what you were trying to do is solve a problem. The problem was, how do I stay here?
Yeah. And that's when that certainly wasn't the end of that journey.
Sure.
The end of that journey only happened in 2020, believe it or not. Where I'm now officially a permanent resident of Florence. I can stay here, or for Italy, the EU, in fact. I can stay here for the rest of my life. I have a permanent, card that I only have to renew every 10 years, that sort of thing. But it's literally the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, getting legal here.
Yeah.
I don't have Italian ancestry. I'm self-employed. And when you get a visa, you get it for certain reasons. You're a student visa, or you're working for an Italian company, or you're just rich, which has got its own visa. I think they call it the elective residency. But they don't have they don't have a self-employment visa. What they do have, though, is a loophole, or at least they did 15 years ago when I exploited this loophole, that if you are a student in Italy in a real Italian school, and you graduate with a higher degree, so master's or higher, and that degree is in the field in which you want to work, you can convert your student visa into a self-employment visa. So I got a master's degree just to qualify for that loophole, and that's what made me legal for the first time.
And you had to do that at an Italian school.
Yeah.
And what was that in?
It was a degree in sacred art and liturgy.
Oh, that's right.
From the Vatican.
I remember seeing that in your biography.
Yeah. Not bad for an atheist.
That was what I was when I read the biography. That was what a question was.
Am I religious?
Are you religious?
I was born and raised
does that
Catholic.
Play into how you approach sculpture, what you're interested in terms of sculpture. Because that's a very, very specific degree.
It is. It's a very specific degree, and a very rewarding degree in a lot of ways. And I'm really glad I did that degree. So I was born and raised Catholic, went to Catholic school, but I don't ever remember a time when I actually ever truly believed in just about any sort of divinity. Not within me. I'm just a little bit too logical, I think, and not to say that people who are religious are illogical, but faith by definition is believing in something where there's insufficient evidence. So I just can't get over that hump. So I knew the lingo from being raised Catholic, and I certainly knew the aesthetic. And I have respect for religions generally. For religious people, sometimes maybe not so much. Religion is great in the abstract, but we don't have to go down that avenue. But what the degree itself was in, sacred art and liturgy. So sacred art is different from religious art. Religious art is just art with a religious theme. Sacred art is a tool used in the celebration of that religion. So it's things like a church. It's an altar. It is the vestments that the priest wears. It's the music. It's the stained glass windows. It's the pulpit, the baptismal font, the tabernacle on the high altar, the altar itself. All these things have particular forms and particular styles and particular modes and traditions as well. And symbolism is attached to every aspect of it. A tabernacle on an altar needs to be certain colors and made out of certain materials, and it basically has 5 different main forms it can take. It can look like a bird. It can look like a temple. It can, all these sorts of different things. And if you can have candles on the altar, there's 7 candles, and that represents something. And so everything in a church has meaning and has rules and structure to it. And so basically this degree it's basically, how to be an interior decorator for a church, how to actually outfit a church so that you're not, sort of going off, and being, what's the word? Not heretical, but just not theologically sound or not theologically based. And what that degree really did for me in my own work is make me understand just how much every aspect of my work or any artwork conveys a message. The turn of a head, the glance of an eye, the color palette that you use, the tonal values, if we're talking about a painting, everything needs to be considered because whether you intend it or not, it's saying something.
Right.
And I remember taking a look at my work and going, oh, I have this sort of habit or that sort of fallback that I do. I always do feet the same way. Well, maybe let's, even though I'm, working from a model, I try as much as possible, to do the foot or whatever exactly as I see it. There are little shortcuts that have worked their way into my technique. So it's made me more conscious of the effects of my work in terms of what it conveys and how it conveys, and I just take it to a much deeper level now. Textures and just everything counts. Everything counts, whether you know it or not.
Yeah.
It's gonna mean something to someone. It's going to impart a point of view. People will have no idea why they like your work or don't like their work. There's just something about it. That something about it is something you can control if you're aware of it.
Right. And I think there's a lot of, it must make living in Europe, Florence specifically, even more inspiring. Because
you can read the art a lot more easily.
Church to church, right? Yeah, you have this language that you understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Makes it more meaningful.
Yeah. It's basically, you've seen like the Da Vinci Code, right? So I basically got a degree in what Tom Hanks was.
Yeah.
That I know symbols in art, and this is saying something,
Yeah.
and this color means this, and that's actually 100% true. It really is. I mean, they're not encoding crazy conspiracy theories in art, but there is so much that gets put into art that we just don't read anymore.
Yeah,
I don't know the language.
It's something that I've talked to my kids a lot about, and that is that knowledge is a superpower. That like when you learning another language, I can walk around Italy and it just sounds pretty to me, but I don't know what anybody's saying.
Right.
It's a world I can't access.
Right. That doesn't mean it's a secret language.
Right.
Right. Italian is it's just a language you don't know.
Right. And
same thing with painting and sculpture.
Absolutely. And I think that, that's what, again, with my kids, I'm just always kind of like nudging them, like having travel experiences. I'm here with two of my daughters. And, the excitement for me is they're getting these experiences. They're seeing things that maybe they've only heard about, and now they know what it smells like in the Louvre, and they know what it is like to walk the streets of Florence. And I think that travel, learning another language, anything that you learn, it becomes a superpower. You have access to so much more that makes your life fuller, that other people don't have. And again, it becomes this like amazing superpower. And I think that my hope for them is that they catch that bug where they're just constantly craving knowledge. That's the key. And it doesn't really matter if it's in art or not, and right.
Lots of people have that sort of superpower. For some people it's mathematics, for others, there's, as long as you're passionate about it, it becomes a superpower. Passion, right. It's that's what it really is passion. I think it really comes down to that.
Yeah. So you go to Cecil, you become a sculptor, full-blown sculptor, you find a way to live here again, and now you Where did the art history come in? That's not necessarily a degree, but it's a personal interest, and
Yes.
and you're like basically have your doctorate. That's sort of
No, I don't.
well. I mean, you know what I mean. I mean, you've done a lot of research.
I'm almost completely self-taught. I never
Yeah.
actually went to school for art history, and I resisted for years calling myself an art historian.
Yeah.
It's only when all the other art historians started calling me an art historian, and then
Yeah.
just working professionally as an art historian. It's like,
Yeah.
it's not something you graduate and get your art historian card.
Right.
It's not you can get a degree in it, but that doesn't make you an art historian.
Right.
It's just, are people paying for your stories?
Yeah.
then you're an art historian. So this is kind of the big overarching theme of my career. I mentioned, that I got interested in art history, fairly early on. And, as anyone and everyone does when they study history or study art in Florence. Yeah. What made it particular for me was that at a certain point, I was looking around. Well, this is kind of fairly early on as well. Knowing nothing about art, but then going around and, oh my gosh, Florence, go to the Bargello, and you see all the work everywhere. When I started sculpting, I figured, okay, this is what all our sculpture is going to look like, right? It's going to look like the stuff I see around town. I mean, obviously not as good, but it's going to be of a kind, in the family. And it wasn't at all. And I didn't know what that thing was. What I later found out, it was that, because we weren't classicists, we weren't trying to emulate the Greeks like most people in the Renaissance were, or in the 19th century, and when I did come across the work of historical sculptors whose work I felt an affinity to, for some reason they were all 19th century French, and some English and some American even. But it's like, what's going on with this 19th century stuff? Why is my stuff more like it? Is it just because I'm closer to them in time? And, and I found out, no, okay, it's the classical idiom. I'm not trying to idealize. I'm trying to do what I see. And okay, well, where does that come from? Who's the guy that started this? And I think it was Charles Cecil who told me, oh, this guy, his name is Francois Rude. He's the father of naturalism in sculpture.
Okay, you did a podcast on him. I'm going to have to go listen to it tonight.
Oh, yes. Well, let me get started here. Francois Rude. So I'm like, okay, Francois Rude, is there any books on him? No books. No books. And of course, this is still even before the internet. So Francois Rude, okay, naturalism, I should explain just in case there's someone who, this is the teacher in me coming out. Naturalism, basically I define it as, realism is doing what is there. Naturalism is doing what you see is there. So it's reality filtered through a perception, right? At least that's how I more or less define it. And I'm not like, I will, this is a hill I'm going to die on in terms of my definition. This is just loosely how I perceive it and conceive it. And he's the father. And he also happens to be the guy that, I know how I heard Francois Rude's name first. It was through Charles, but so my first love was Jean-Antoine Houdon, one of the greatest portrait sculptors. I was going to a portrait school, and so, gravitating towards portraiture. That's what we did mostly. And so Houdon, oh my God, amazing. And then, okay, who else? Oh my God, who's this guy? Jean-Baptiste Carpeau. He's incredible. Ugolino in the Met, the dance on the facade of the Paris Opera, and just incredibly vivacious portraits that, make Houdon look wooden sometimes. I'm like, oh my God, I want to know what that guy knows. Who taught that guy? Oh, that guy was taught by Francois Rude, the father of naturalism in sculpture. I'm like, I need to find out about this guy. So I do as much research. And by now, the internet is starting to crank up a little bit. Go ahead.
Was this at the same period as naturalism in painting?
No. So it came late to sculpture.
Okay.
Because sculpture, especially, on a large scale, bronze, marble, is a much more official. It was used much more by the powers that be to promote whatever sort of propaganda they wanted to, right? And so it moved a lot more slowly in artistic progress at several stages than painting does. Painting is smaller and intimate. It doesn't, it's not necessarily a public thing, where sculpture is almost always in some form public, at least on a scale that's going to influence other artists. And so, the Enlightenment comes along, Winkelmann comes along, Napoleon comes along, and Napoleon's like, okay, neoclassicism, that's my brand, right? And so, while in painting you get the British school of painters in the late 18th century, and the sort of dichotomy between the Romantics and the classical people all through the Napoleonic time, sculpture was firmly entrenched in neoclassicism. It was only till the 1830s that it really started to break out, and it still took a few decades of really, before it really became accepted. But Francois Rude was in the vanguard for that. He wasn't the first, he wasn't the only, but he was the most important, mostly because of what he taught. And so I find this, the only biography I can find for him, it's in French, and I'm looking for a copy of the book. Google Books was a new thing, but they didn't have this book. And I'm like, this is like the first biography, the earliest biography, and it was called, the only thing I knew about it was that it was called Francois Rude, His Life, His work, and his teaching. And it was in 3 sections: his life, a biography, a catalogue raisonné, and then a step-by-step method of his process.
Wow.
And I'm like, holy cow. Only 1,500 copies ever printed.
Wow.
Never translated. It was published in 1856, one and done. I locate a copy of this in a Parisian bookseller. Again, this is now online. Yay. And I spend several $100s, and I buy this book, and I have it's in that bookshelf right there. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to read this, and I'm going to I'm going to figure it out, because is he working like I'm working? Mm-hmm. Because the idea of the sculpture department at Charles Cecil was to see if he could revive this technique. Is this the technique I'm reviving? Or is it similar to it? What am I doing right? What am I doing wrong or differently? And so I read it, and I laboriously translate it, and I do realize that it's not exactly sight size as I practice it, but it absolutely is sight size. It is entirely dependent on spatial relationships, your sculpture and your model being viewed at a distance in a certain way using plumb lines, also using compasses in several different ways, both as visual references and then also 3-dimensional. So it's sort of like Francois Rude's method is like sight size with triangulation, but it's not merely only triangulation. And so I read this. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is great. I'm gonna publish a translation. It's in the public domain. So I'm gonna write this thing, and then I want to write commentary, to accompany this, saying, this is what we did at Charles Cecil, and this is But then I started to really sort of doubt myself. It's like, am I just repeating the work of another art historian? Has someone else already discovered this? Is this just old news and I just don't have the resources to locate, this book? And it's like, and plus, how do I compare and contrast this to what sculpture was at the time? What made this revolutionary? How is it different from what the École des Beaux-Arts was teaching? And so I'm like, I need to know a lot more about art history generally to be able to write this book, to publish this translation. And this was in 2008 when I got a hold of this book. And I was actually still in the States my last time in my last studio. 2009 was when I made my permanent transition. And so around 2011, I was like, okay, I'm going to be, make some serious inroads. I started buying books and doing research. And it's right around that time. By the way, I was now, at that point, living above St. Mark's Church, where my statue was. My statue was on my front door. And the church, which is, as I said, kind of one of the social centers of Florence, had a little cultural events program. And they said, Jason, you're studying art history. Why don't you give us a series of lectures? And I'm like, great, this is great. I can sort of use this as a structure of my studies, right? So I took 9 months off of just about everything else. I mean, I was teaching teaching independently, just like barely squeaking by. And I think I had a commission or two at that time as well. So squeaking by that way. I was no longer, well, I was kind of teaching for Charles Cecil. I was teaching Charles Cecil students, but in my own studio at the time. And so I'm like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. So it was 9 lectures, 1 a month for 9 months, spanning the history of the Western European tradition of sculpture from the beginning of the Renaissance to present day. And so for, a month at a time, like, okay, this is my block. This is what I'm going to, study. And I learned obviously so much more than I could put into a single lecture,
Sure.
And so it was very successful. People loved the presentation that I did, and everyone's like, oh, you need to do a YouTube channel. This is great. You can't just let all this information go away. And then I thought, well, no one's going to sit and watch me like you guys talk about sculpture. They're going to, but if I do a podcast, because I've been listening to podcasts now,
Sure.
and I know all the other sculptors listen to podcasts, like I'm going to turn this into a podcast.
Yeah.
And so that was the genesis of the Sculptor's Funeral. So I took each of those 9 lessons and exploded them into 4 or 5 different episodes each, because I had learned so much more than I could cram into an hour. So this is where the knowledge started spilling out, and this is how I was able to do 35 episodes in 35 weeks, and they're
Wow.
hour-long podcasts, and so just blah, and by the time that first 9 months, that first season of the podcast was done, it had gotten out, and it transformed my career. It transformed my life. It opened doors I never knew were even there.
Yeah.
Because I was the only podcast, still pretty much am, the only podcast that talks about figurative sculpture, dedicated to that. And I do it from, the interesting context of being a practitioner and an art historian. And after a while, I stopped doing quotes when I say art historian, but at that time I was an art historian. And so people started contacting me for, lessons, coming to Florence and studying with me in my studio, or me going and teaching workshops. And so starting in 2015, I started traveling and doing workshops, and it's been amazing. It's taken me all over the world. I've been to Australia and New Zealand multiple times. I've taught in New York City. I've taught in Homer, Alaska. I've taught all over the UK, and I continue to do that. I've really pared down. I more and more I appreciate my time in the studio.
Sure.
I mean, traveling is great. And traveling is great when it's novel, but do I need to go to Australia for the 3rd time in 3 years? It's a grind.
Oh, that flight would kill me.
Yeah. I mean, but it's an adventure and I love it. But I love being in my studio more. This is where. And anyway, so the podcast and the success in my teaching suddenly became center stage.
Yeah.
And so I started the podcast in 2014, and until 2020, I now have like 90 episodes, and I was teaching all over the place. In 2019, right before the pandemic, I was gone out of the studio for 6 months at a time.
Wow.
6 months I was gone, from like March to August. And I come home like, oh no, I can't do this schedule. This is killing me. I'll pare it down. Little did I know I wasn't going to leave Florence for 2 years because of the pandemic. And that sort of reoriented things. And I started thinking, hey, remember why I started this podcast in the first place? It's because I wanted to teach myself art history so that I could write this book.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm like, I'm going to start writing this book again. Right. So during the pandemic, I start working on, the translation and the commentary, and the commentary just grows and grows and grows. And it's like dwarfing the book, because the book is not very big. And I also feel like I'm not really getting under the skin of the person of Francois Rude like I should, because he's got this crazy story, and a lot of things, when you just read the facts of his life, don't make sense. You're like, why did he do that? What was he thinking? Why? But at the end of the day, he, sort of invents this new technique. And so 3/4 of the way done with this book, I put it aside and I rewrite it, starting about 2 years ago now, as a historical novel. It's called Rude's Awakening. At least that's the working title. The editors will, I'm sure, or the publisher will probably make me change it, but I'm a sucker for puns. So it's called Rude's Awakening. And it really is kind of the story of an awakening, because like Francois Rude, So in a nutshell, his life. He is, humble son of a blacksmith, as they always are. And he makes his way to Paris, becomes the darling of the École des Beaux-Arts, wins the Prix de Rome, right? This is in 1812. He couldn't go to Rome for 2 years because of the Napoleonic Wars were bankrupting France, and there wasn't enough money to send him to Rome. By the time he is finally able to go to Rome, this is right after, he's actually on his way down to Rome, still in France, when Napoleon's 100 Days happens. His foster father is a prominent journalist and sort of a politico, and he took a position, a fairly prominent one, in Napoleon's government of the Cent-Jours, the 100 Days. And so when Napoleon falls and he gets exiled, Louis Fremier, Francois Rude's foster father, has to go into exile too, and he takes his family to Brussels, where a lot of expats go. That's where Jacques-Louis David, for instance, ends up, and he ends up dying there. And Francois Rude decides to not go to Rome, throws away his ticket to the Prix de Rome, and self-imposes himself into exile with his foster father in Brussels at the age of he's like 32 at that point. He does it for a couple of reasons. One, he's in love with his foster father's daughter, who he eventually marries, and she's an amazing painter as well. She becomes Jacques-Louis David's copyist. And he languishes in obscurity in Brussels for 12 years, doing decorative flourishes for the palace ballroom and, friezes for the hunting lodge of the king and that sort of thing. Nothing really challenging. But another reason he does it is because he's completely disillusioned with the meat grinder of the École des Beaux-Arts. For 6 years, he put himself through the ringer and was broken like a horse into becoming this sculptor, producing this sort of milquetoast late neoclassicism, which just wasn't his thing. He actually, before going to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, he was at the École des Beaux-Arts de Dijon. He was from Dijon, and the teacher there
I lived in Dijon for a couple months.
Oh, Dijon's awesome.
It's a
I was.
cool
Yeah.
place.
So the Place Francois Rude, down that street is his house. It's where the carousel is and the fountain.
I did not put that together.
Just a block from the École from the Place de, I don't know what it's called. Is it Libération? The one in front of the Ducal Palace. In the center. Yeah, he lived like 2 blocks away from there. I was there a year ago, almost 2 years ago. Yeah, doing research.
Wow.
I love Dijon.
I was going to ask, do you, when you're doing this, do you have to contact the family?
They're all dead.
There's no surviving.
No surviving family. No.
Wow.
He only had one son who died, spoiler for my book, when he was 8 years old. And yeah, even distant. I think the last Rude died in 1910. He was hit by a truck in Beaune.
Wow.
Yeah, but anyway, so I will wrap this up really quickly. I know I'm very long-winded. This is literally my favorite subject to talk about on Earth. But so he languishes in obscurity for 12 years in Brussels. While he's there, he opens up his own little atelier, takes in students, but he decides he's going to not teach what the École des Beaux-Arts offered because he didn't like that anyway. He decides to reinvent his sculpture process from scratch. He is heavily influenced by two things. Joseph Jacotot, I mentioned before, who is this experimental educator. He comes up with this idea of the theory of universal education, where anyone can teach anything to anyone, even if the teacher doesn't know the subject.
Interesting.
Which sounds crazy, but it's really just kind of an elaborate cryptography, I won't get into it. Read the book if it ever gets published. But anyway, so he's like, okay, I have the mental tools to teach myself a new way to sculpt. But he's also influenced by this book that was a prize-winning essay in 1801. The Institut de France put out an essay contest because they wanted to change art because, Napoleon's here, neoclassicism, the Enlightenment's here, the old regime's out. We're going to do new art. What is the best art? The Greeks. And so they put out a two-part question. They said, what explains the perfection of Greek art, and how can we attain that perfection? Right? And the essay that won the prize is 500 pages long, written by a guy named Émeric David, to Saint Bernard Émeric David. And he basically says, Winckelmann's got it all wrong. You don't emulate the Greeks. You don't copy the style of the Greeks. If you want to be Greek, you work like the Greeks worked. How did the Greeks work? They studied nature. And so he ties everything back into the study and observation of the human model rather than relying on canons of proportion or knowledge of anatomy or any sort of imposed aesthetic, right? And the Institute gave him the award, said thank you very much, and changed nothing, right? They just continued.
Interesting.
Yeah. But this book was like, sort of like the underground, sort of like the, almost like anarchist cookbook, young sculptors were passing. Do you see what this guy's saying? Because he totally trashes the Institut de France in the essay as well. And so it's sort of like a sort of a rebellious little tract, but no one has really taken it up and sort of moved forward with it. And so Francois Rude, with nothing to lose in Brussels, says, okay, I'm gonna take this theory of universal education and combine it with the precepts and the goals of this essay, and I'm going to invent a new technique. And he does, and he teaches it, and it's amazing. He comes back to Paris, and it's not the first work he unveils at the Salon. He's in Paris for a couple of years, but he finally, in 1833, shows Neapolitan fisher boy playing with a tortoise. And it is an absolute game changer of a sculpture. You look at it today and you go, oh, cute little genre piece. But it was mind-blowing at the time when you can sort of, kind of forget what you know about the rest of the 19th century. Both sides, both the Romantics and the Classicists, claimed it for themselves. They both camps, opposing camps, pointed at this one sculpture and said, this is what we're talking about. Right?
Interesting.
Because his work is as timeless as Greek work, but it's also completely unadorned. It's literally just truth. Francois Rude became the sculptor of truth, and in being faithful to truth, he ennobled it, right? In the way that the classicists like. And that's what leads him to being chosen to do the one of the reliefs for the Arc de Triomphe, which is his masterpiece.
Wow.
And then he goes on and opens up a Parisian atelier for 10 years where he teaches Emmanuel Fremier, who is like a nephew. He teaches Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. He teaches Paul Cabet. He teaches a lot of other people, right?
Yeah.
And that is the genesis of what later becomes known as the French manner or the French technique or Gallicism. When Jules Deleuze, who was taught by Carpeaux, who was taught by Rude, goes to the UK in 1870, he teaches them the French manner. And it completely transforms English sculpture and becomes an entirely new movement known even to this day as the New Sculpture Movement.
Wow.
The Beaux-Arts movement in sculpture in the United States is based on this method.
Do you know anything about the sculptor Alfred Fairbanks?
I know the name. He's an American.
He's an American.
Yeah. I'm not up on my 19th century Americans like I should be.
He's
it's
a
literally
Utah
my
guy.
next area of study.
He's a Utah guy, so it's just
I thought you guys
interesting
liked, what's his name?
Maynard Dick. Well, no, that's not Maynard.
The Danish neoclassicist Thorvaldsen.
Oh yeah.
The
Of
Jesus,
course,
right?
of course.
The Mormon Jesus.
No, Alfred Fairbanks was one of the early Utah guys. There was a couple of Utah guys that went to Paris and studied, and I was just wondering how much of that. I would assume that he brought back that.
Well, the thing is, it was never really taught at the École des Beaux-Arts. Even when you got Carpeaux in 1868 doing the dance and everything, they're like, this is an orgy in stone, and this is such a bad way to work. We want to be academics, academicism, right? So of course, it bleeds in, but it never really becomes a part of the curriculum. And so you won't find books written by like Charles Blanc or whatever, that lay out the tenets of this work, which is why it got lost.
How much of that influenced Rodin?
To a certain extent, but not. It certainly influenced him, but I don't even want to say to what extent, because that is also something I haven't really studied, particularly Rodin. I'm not actually a big fan of Rodin, but I need to, and I've studied him somewhat. I've done a couple podcast episodes on him, so I know the basics. But in terms of the nitty gritty of his training and technique, well, he never went to the École des Beaux-Arts. He applied and failed 3 times. He went to the Petite École, which is fine. Actually, sometimes the Petite École was much more progressive than the than the École des Beaux-Arts. And it's also where Jules Deleuze studied, and where Carpeaux taught for a while. So I don't know.
I'm just interested. He seemed to be kind of in line with that sort of naturalistic way of observing. And
but he I think he takes it in a different direction.
Yeah, certainly.
Which is actually one of that doesn't mean that he wasn't, sort of practicing this sort of method, because the glory of sight-size technique generally and the French manner that Rude instituted is that it's a highly individualistic technique. You get 10 sculptors all working off the same model using the same method. You get 10 different sculptures, all of which look like the model, right? Because again, it is reality filtered through perception. We all perceive things differently, right? And so, it holds true in every class I teach. I'll have, half a dozen students, and they're all working on the same model. They're all working the same thing, but it's what they bring to the sculpture that makes the difference. And, because we're not robots. We don't just take in information and spit it out. Although the training is that that's what you try to do as well as possible.
Excuse me.
Go for it. Of course.
Sorry.
Yeah. One of the sort of tenets of the method is, try to clear your brain of all preconceptions about what you're looking at. Because as soon as you start to think of, I'm sculpting a nose, your subconscious goes through the Rolodex and go, nose. A nose should be this and this and this, right? And suddenly it's an amalgam of what you know and what you see, right? So the more you can clear your mind about what you know, the more clearly you can just absorb what you see and put it into your work. But you will fail every time you do it, because we're not robots. We're not 3D scanners. But that's the beauty of the technique, because it's the quality and the character of your failure. That is your true style, because it's nothing you're consciously imposing. Anytime you impose something consciously, that's mannerism. True style is, this is a person. I'm making this exactly as I see this person. And everyone else says, well, it's not exactly how it is.
Yeah.
And then you put that head alongside 10 others by the same artist, and you go, okay, there's a family resemblance. That is true style.
It's interesting, because I think that that is maybe the most, I think in order to retain that in students, in order to not bleed that out of them by...
Bleed what out of them? I'm sorry.
The individuality, the perception.
You can't. No one becomes a robot.
Well, to some degree... if you're giving the same critique over and over relative to a method, which happens in the academies just because the method is easier to teach. It requires a far more higher degree of sophistication and awareness on the part of the teacher to allow for the perception of the student, to recognize it, allow for it, and to understand that truth is relative. And maybe this goes back to the atheistic point of view as well. But I feel I learned this lesson. I had in 2011. I had teachers from Angel Academy, Florence Academy, and the GCA that came to my studio. Yeah, Grand Central. And they all came to my studio for a month-long workshop. And it was supposed to be like, we're going to see the subtle differences in these three different methods. And I remember my friend from the Florence Academy started this painting. And I had hired a platinum blonde model with super fair skin. I designed this dress for her that was all white. It was white on white on white. It was sort of after Abbott Henderson's Thayer, the portrait of the young girl that's in the National Portrait Gallery. And so I was thinking of a painting all about unity. And he came and he started, my friend from Florence Academy came and he started painting her, and it looked like her flesh was sunburned. And I'm looking at it like like, what are you doing? Like, you're better than this. I don't know. What are you even looking at? Like, she's so pale. And I sat down and looked at his painting and then back at the model and back and forth. And I realized he was looking for the differences from the flesh to the white of the dress and emphasizing those. And I was looking for the similarities, which is a civics lesson as well. I was looking for the unifying qualities of those things, but both were true.
Yeah.
And I think that that was a good lesson to me because there's so many different ways to interpret something. There's so many different ways to perceive something. And there's so many different decisions along the way based on that perception, all of which can be true.
And as long as they're honest, they are true.
Yeah.
Because they're true to your perception.
Right.
Right. So, and again, I this is a hill I will die on. You cannot beat you can't beat individuality out of a person through the teaching of a technique, no matter how rigorous. You're just not going to become literally a copyist of nature. You can become a copyist of manner.
Yes, that's where I would say the individuality I've seen over and over and over beaten out of people is with the manner being so heavy-handed that it becomes the only way they can solve the problem. Or I mean, part of that you have to take certain personal responsibility on with the artist as well.
That's literally what I was going to say. No, with the student as well. Right?
Yes, that's what I mean by the artist, by the student.
Yeah, because it's not everyone who can. It's not even something you. See, I think we're probably talking about the same thing, but probably just using different terms. So I don't see it as, a strict method or a strict teacher beats creativity out of it, and it's only the few that survive. I think it's like everyone learns a solid, teachable, learnable technique, and the creative ones take it somewhere.
Yeah.
So I think I think we're probably saying the same thing.
Right. Yeah. For me, I have a theory that if you can give space for people to make their own decisions, to come to their own decisions, to go through the necessary clumsiness of making their own decisions, to the side of the method, allow the method to do what it's meant to do, which is help you see more accurately and increase your observational skills, but to give them space to make their own decisions through the necessary clumsiness that will eventually become their truest voice, their most individualistic self. Maybe you increase the number of or the percentage of people that end up finding more individuality versus only the highest level of creative individuals end up. I don't know. I'm not saying this very well at all.
No,
it is a small percentage of people, and this has been true in some of the critiques I've read of the 19th century as well. That out of every 1,000 students, 999 end up being copyists, and one has something to say. It's always going to be the case that the majority of us end up sort of regurgitating what's in front of us, or
I really want to jump in on this because it's something I agree with very, very strongly, and I think it's an issue plaguing our specific time because for the last two generations, we're just coming out of the nadir of figurative arts. We're finally getting a little bit back on our feet, but it's a shadow of its former self, and so we've been focused on mastery, learning how, and kind of forgetting the question of why. I know how to sculpt, but I don't know why to sculpt, right?
Yes.
And it's not just the academies that sort of ignore that question. Because nobody actually knows the answer. You see, back in every other time period in history, the arts had a reason to exist. And yes, it wasn't always a positive reason. Largely, sculpture existed as tools of the projection of propaganda or power, or aggrandizement of the wealthy and powerful, religious propaganda, or just all sorts of different things. But at least there was work, right? But now we live in a fantastic, multicultural, democratic, multinational society where we don't have a single controlling voice of, King Louis XIV of France, or the Pope, or Lorenzo de' Medici, or Napoleon Bonaparte, or even the Institut de France, right? We don't have a governing body saying this is what art needs to be, right? And that's a good thing, right? Art can be anything we want. But the problem with art being anything we want, coupled with the fact that it is less important now than it has ever been in terms of not art but painting and sculpture, just because it's been supplanted by visual arts and music and recorded media, and everything from the internet to Netflix and iTunes. So it doesn't have the centrality it used to. So not only have we been pushed to the sidelines, but we don't have anyone. We don't have a guiding. We don't have a guidepost. A lodestar. Is that a word? Anyway, you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And so we're free to do whatever we want, but we haven't really figured out what we want to do. I think collectively, it's not something we're going to sit around in a symposium. It has to, and it will eventually arise organically, but we're sooner or later going to figure out what we're supposed to be doing with art. And we're at a period in time where collectively, generally, we might all have individual reasons to do art and individual goals, but we are not moving together down any sort of path, other than mastery. But okay, great, we've got that now. We've got 100 fantastic painters and sculptors. What do they do now?
Yeah,
and I think this is something that I think, and this is why I'm not so keen on Rodin as well, is because he was brilliant in being the first sculptor to say you can just make a human body that has no identity, has no cultural baggage. It's just flesh for flesh's sake. We don't even have to have a head and arms. We can just have a torso on walking legs. Is it alive? Is it dead? Is it, it's stripped of its humanity. Isn't that brilliant and genius? And yes, it is for him to do it. But 5 generations on, we're still doing that same sort of thing. We're regurgitating torsos left and right because that's what sells in galleries, precisely because it doesn't have an identity and a narrative and a story, and it doesn't make an opinion, because as soon as you go down one direction with, this is what this character is going to be in terms of, any sort of identity or meaning, that's going to eliminate a certain segment of the possible buying populace, right? And that's not what gallerists like. They want the most anonymous, pretty work, gratuitous nudes left and right. And we wonder why no one is interested in painting and sculpture anymore. It's because we don't talk to our audience anymore. Yeah. We need to figure out a way to reconnect with culture on its terms, not on our terms. And this is the big thing that painters and sculptors, especially the classicists of today, think that, we have to educate the public and, we have to explain to them why we're important. That's bullshit.
You're right.
That's bullshit. We need to become relevant. Who is the biggest household name, whether you love him or hate him, in art today? It's Banksy. Why? Because he does stuff that is immediately available. It's literally on the street. He gives it away for free. You can go see it. And he talks about, and yes, he can be, trite and sort of, childish sometimes and whatever. Sometimes he's clever, sometimes he's not. Doesn't matter, but at least he's trying to communicate to today's audience. And he's not trying to harken back to a more glorious time for art.
That's an interesting point, because it's not all about, like, one thing I talk to students about is the why of what you're doing. Why are you studying this? Why do you want to be good at this? Why are you trying to be technically good at this? You have to have that internal motivation of what is it that I want to say.
And the great artists have that first. right?
Absolutely.
And I'm not calling myself a great artist, but I brought my ethos of storytelling into sculpture. Sculpture is the vehicle for the stories I want to tell.
Right.
I didn't become a sculptor and go, now what stories do I tell?
Yeah.
You know, I was a storyteller before. I just switched media.
Yeah, and I think that the great artists have that as their motivation throughout the process of their education.
Yeah.
They never lose sight of what it is that drives them to, learn to turn form better, have better proportion, or understand how to define weight better, or whatever. But I think there's another question of why that you're touching on that's really important, which is why is what we make relevant in our time period? Because we're trying so hard to understand the techniques of the past because they really created the greatest art, the greatest, most lasting, relevant art that we relate to on a human level outside of time. So we want to emulate the quality in terms of technical quality, but we also, I think, especially in the academies, there's a little bit of you get lost in the fact that the art that we're studying has nothing to do with the culture we currently exist in. It's just not at all the same kind of, like when you're talking about studying those things with the church and whatever, that is a lost language. We don't, churches typically don't follow those standards or use those symbols as much to it doesn't read to a public. The public doesn't speak that language anymore. Right. And so even if they put those symbols in things, the public is blind to it. So what is it that understanding our own culture and understanding our own time is so important to asking that separate question of why is painting important to the people of today? What are the messages and narratives?
I don't think that's the right question to ask. Why is painting important to people today? Painting, ladies and gentlemen, is not important to the people of today. You heard it here first, all right? And it is not our job to convince people. See, this is exactly the way I think we should not be thinking about it.
Okay.
We shouldn't have to go out and convince other people of our worth, right? If the work doesn't do it, then what are we really doing, right? We shouldn't have to convince people of our worth. We have to become worthy, right? And you're talking about the academies, they don't teach why to do art, and I don't think they should. What you need to do is to train artists who are already innately engaged and concerned with their culture and have something to say about their culture.
Yeah.
And training in art essentially is just giving them the tools of communication, right? It is not the reason, getting good is not the reason to become an artist. Being able to tell your stories is the reason, to tell it. And it doesn't have to be stories. It doesn't have to be narrative or religious. But if you're not communicating, then maybe you shouldn't be. And if you have no desire to communicate, maybe you shouldn't be a representational artist.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean by, why are paintings important? It's what I mean is, what are the narratives that we can share? What is the message that we want to share beyond just beauty? And I don't think that beauty in itself is irrelevant. I think it's absolutely relevant, will always be relevant.
Sure.
But I think there's more than that. I think that we have to tap into who we are as people, what it means to be a human being in 2024.
Right.
And what are the
And that's something that no academy is going to be able to teach you.
Right.
Because it's going to be different for everybody.
Yeah.
And I don't know how wise it is for an academy to be agenda driven, regardless of how lofty the goals are.
Yeah.
We know of a couple of agenda driven academies, and they don't produce good work,
Yeah.
right? They're more interested in the message than the art. And they should be really just sort of totally focused on the art.
Yeah.
And it's when the right people come along to learn the art, they're the ones who are going to get their message out, because that's what they're interested in first and foremost.
Yeah.
You know? And again, I think it's a problem with our generations, the people that are alive today. Again, we, have been struggling so long and so hard to become masters of our craft. Now we need to go, okay, well, where do we go from here? And it's not, let's get more masterful, or let's open a school to teach more masters. It's got to be, the right people, because we've taught enough of us. There should be some of us who have something really cogent, and direct to say to our society. And so the next thing we need to do is find a platform for them, right? Because those people already exist. Those people exist today who have the mastery and who have something to say. We need to figure out a platform.
Yeah, and like we were talking about earlier, so many of the people who were great storytellers or great mirrors to society, that may have found an avenue in painting in the 19th century, are now in film, are now in...
That's where the Michelangelos are now.
Video game design. In
sure.
Yeah, so
that's
many...
where all the real talent... you and I, we're not real talent.
I've never been under the illusion that I'm a real talent.
It's if you want to really be a functioning, active participant in the societal conversation, you go into TikTok. You really do,
Yeah.
or film or music, and you'll reach a much huger audience than any sculptor could ever reach.
And that plays to something I've been talking a lot about lately, in the last little while, which is this relevance, this idea of relevance. I feel like TikTok has taught us something, Instagram has taught us something, and that is that without much to say and without much talent with any for any given thing, but with some dedication to clever video making, you can manufacture your own relevance. How many TikTok stars and influencers? I mean, this is the new thing. If you ask the younger generation, what is it you want to be when you grow up? One of the big answers is, I want to be an influencer. And what I've learned from that is that you don't have to have much substance to you at all, but if you have some discipline in making stupid videos, compelling videos that are 30 seconds long, you can manufacture your own relevance. And we've seen it time and time again in this generation. And the hope that gives me is that our world is full of brilliant people. I was talking to Amy Florence today, and just about how lucky we are to be in this field where almost everybody we meet is kind and genuine and talented and brilliant, and I'm always surprised by, I shouldn't be surprised, but I'm so lucky. I feel so lucky to be in this field. But also, we haven't really done anything to follow the current trends of manufacturing our relevance. We haven't put a camera on what we're doing.
It's because what we're doing is not painting and sculpture. You can take pictures of them. You can make movies of them. But that's not painting and sculpture.
It's
when
not.
I said we need to find our
story.
platform, I didn't mean TikTok. We need to. It can't be an app.
What I mean is, we're struggling in part for public commissions. We're struggling in part for patronage. There's a lot of these elements of financial support and opportunities that hold us back because painting and sculpture has become less relevant in our culture. And I think that one of the reasons for that is that interest has followed TikTok, and it's followed Instagram, and it's followed movies, and it's followed streaming content.
It's not an either or though. It's just we can't and we shouldn't try to beat them at their own game. You know, we're not going to replace TikTok. We need to find a new relevance. We need to make painting and sculpture do something it's never done before. What is that? I have no idea. But the person who figures that out, that's your next Michelangelo.
But don't you feel like if more people were aware that it was happening? I don't know how many times you've heard this, but I hear it all the time. I didn't know people still painted like that.
Sure.
I didn't know.
I was one of them until I literally walked into Charles Cecil.
Right. And so I'm just thinking about these platforms that exist for us that we haven't really tapped into.
I mean,
Can there be,
we're all over Instagram and, TikTok as well, and Facebook, certainly, we've got a much higher, collectively got a much higher profile than we have had, maybe this century.
Early 2000s.
I mean, for the last 100 years.
Far less accessible. Yeah. But I still think there could be more of an effort put into visibility because
but everyone's doing that. Man, every artist has an Instagram and TikTok. It's not that they're not visible. It's just that people aren't looking. Right? And it doesn't matter what the platform is. It doesn't matter what app it is. It doesn't matter what you paint or sculpt. It's not the correct medium if you really want to break through.
I wouldn't say it's the correct or incorrect medium. I would say it happens to be the most popular.
Right. But then we need something different, so different that I can't even begin to describe what that is. That's the thing that's going to happen. Otherwise, we're going to continue to be irrelevant. Painting and sculpture has never in the history of the world had to compete with electricity.
Yeah.
That's what it is, right? Before electricity, we were the image makers, and we're the only image makers. And it meant so much more then than any image means now.
Yeah.
Right? We will not regain that place. We need to find a new reason to exist.
I wonder, my question is, in order to find a new reason to exist, is that going to require what it did in the past, which was the combination of not only the talent creating it, but the patronage supporting it?
Well, 100% the patronage supporting it.
That would be my argument for tapping into the popular platforms.
Patronage is not popular. It's literally the opposite. And I mean, unless you're talking about like crowdsourcing, but then you're just watering down. What? I mean, I hate to say it, but we need an art dictator.
I mean, there's a reason why.
We need a Louis XIV. We need a Napoleon. Someone to come along, have infinite money, and say, "This is my taste. Who's with me? I'll buy your work." And that's when you're going to create a movement.
Don't you feel like the Gagosians are those dictators, that they're the ones? And I feel like
in a very small regional way. I mean, I barely know that name.
And
maybe that's my fault. But
there's a reason why. What's his name? He does the balloon sculptures.
Koons.
Yeah, there's a reason why Jeff Koons makes $35 million a sculpture. It's because there's a popularity to it that celebrities come in and will buy it.
No, it's a financial instrument. It's a way to launder money, and it's a way to invest in something and turn around and sell it for more. That's all that sort of art is. And yes, it's dressed like a balloon dog, so some people might like it, but the people who actually generally like it aren't the ones who have the money to buy it. The people who are buying it buy it for purely financial reasons.
I would disagree with that to some degree when you're talking about like celebrities or others who buy it for status, and it certainly it becomes an investment as well. But that's the question for me, is if there is so much money being thrown at art and popularity has something to do with that, can we use the platforms to repopularize what we're doing?
I
And thereby bring in more patronage.
I disagree that the money is being thrown at popular work. I think
Popular names?
I think names become known when a lot of money is thrown at it. Right? Maybe it's a bit chicken and egg.
Excuse me.
But I don't think. I don't think we even need to talk about that side of the art world, because it has nothing to do with what we're trying to do. That's another realm I don't think art needs to compete with. Like figurative art, representational art. It doesn't need to. We don't need a Jeff Koons. We have.
Yeah,
one,
I don't think it's an either or question. I just wonder. The question I'm asking, I don't have an answer for it. These are all theories, and I'm, racking my brain to try and figure out how do you increase patronage, because without the increase of patronage, without the increase of interest, how are we going to break through? How are we going to manufacture our own relevance in order to
by being relevant? I mean, it's that simple and that complex. It's not a matter of making beautiful art or good art, or a lot of art, or sometimes it's not even a matter of artistic visibility. We have to make work that resonates, and when it resonates, people will pursue it. And this isn't a question we're going to solve.
Well, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier, which is it's a global society at this point, right? You're not going to have, like you were talking about with Rude, you're not going to have this French movement, because to create a movement like that requires so much control that the Beaux-Arts may have had.
The opposite. You don't create a movement. A movement happens when enough people feel a certain way. They're going to support the people who are doing the art that supports that feeling. Right? So neoclassicism went on and went on and went on. It was good. It was good. It was good. It was still good all the way to the end. But there were enough people who were tired of the values and ideals of neoclassicism to say, hey, what about the other things? Okay, you've got calm grandeur and noble grandeur and quiet simplicity, but what about passion, right? And what about love? What about fear? What about emotion? What about individuality? And that arose as a societal phenomenon that then promoted the art, right? The art listened to society. Art doesn't change society. It never has. Art responds to society. We're the mirror, right? So all this talk we've done in the last half hour or so, I think it boils down to we need to listen to our society more and champion the values we think are worth championing in our work. And this doesn't mean becoming a political sculptor. I mean, I could be talking about values of social media or values of whatever. If you reflect those values back to people who hold those values dear, that's how you become relevant. It's just that.
It's interesting. It reminds me of a quote. I don't know who it was by, but I feel like Anthony Hopkins may have said it at an Oscars or something. He said, art is not a mirror to reflect society, but a hammer to shape it.
Yeah. Name one time that's happened.
I don't know. I just like
it's a wonderful.
I like the quote.
It's exactly. It's a wonderful quote. We love to aggrandize our place in society.
Well, the other
Servants,
question.
we're slaves to society. Always have been. Always will be. We pretend we're not.
Well, especially today, right, where this idea, this sort of cult of individuality and the singular genius in art is so aggrandized. I feel like there's something in that question too that
Did the mic pick up my stomach just then? Sorry,
I didn't hear it.
Yeah, I certainly did. Sorry.
There's something that I question as well, which is, on the one hand, you're a communicator, and so you have to pay attention to audience reaction. You have to listen to
Otherwise,
the
you're
audience
just
reaction.
a talker.
Right. And so, but there's the internal struggle that I have constantly that I have no idea how to solve for is this idea that, like, a gallery will say, well, you just sold, this sunset beach scene. Can you give me 10 more? Yeah. And like, well, okay, that's the audience response. Like, people really like my landscapes, but I'm more passionately driven by figure and context and sort of narrative and whatever. I find myself less capable, just from a financial standpoint, of pursuing those larger figure works, because the audience keeps saying, we like your simple, sort of generic, pleasing landscapes. And so the question as an artist is, do I just follow that response and do things that I feel like are more decorative and less relevant, less important? Or this is the internal struggle.
The struggle you're having was with your market, right? If you go to a gallery to sell your work, the gallery is going to sell to wealthy people decorating their house. That's who buys it, right? And of course they're going to like your pretty little landscapes or, whatever, right? Because that's the market you're pitching to, right? It's not a matter of your work, and it's not a matter of like general popularity. The gallery system hasn't been around for all that long. There's been art for a lot longer than there's been galleries, and there's a million ways for artists to make a living. Galleries is the worst and the most common way to do it. Everyone tries because it's literally the only system you can plug into. It's the only system that exists for artists. You come out of art school and you're like, what do I do now? Oh, I need to get gallery representation, right? Yeah. Just like everybody else is getting gallery representation. It's cutthroat, and it's going to be lowest common denominator stuff that appeals to the greatest spectrum of the masses. Yeah. So of course they're going to buy your crappy little landscapes and not your important political or social stuff. Yeah. You got to change. You don't change your work, you change your market. Yeah. That's why I don't do galleries. I tried for about 3 years back when I first started back in North Carolina in like the early 2000s. And I realized that that's not why I became a sculptor, to do gratuitous nudes. You know? I became a sculptor simply because, again, I like to tell stories. I just switched my medium. They're not allowing me to sell the work that tells a story. So I'm not going to do a gallery.
Yeah. Yeah, and all of that comes with the anxiety of being self-employed and saying, like, I'm going to switch my market. What is that market? What is the response going to be in this market?
I know 100 different successful artists, and they all are successful in their own way.
Right.
And what I tell every student is, you do two things. You play to your strengths and you play to your interests. Do what you like and do what you're good at. And sooner or later, one or the two will reward you, because sooner or later you're going to be the best. If you keep on doing it, you're going to be the best at what you're good at. Yeah. And so when people want the thing that you're good at and the thing that you like, they're going to come to you. Yeah. Right. So when I first started, it was years before I got my first marble portrait commission, but I'm one of the few people who do marble portraits. Yeah. And then I got good at it, and now I get them regularly. So yeah.
Yeah. There's so much more we could dive into, and
how many episodes is this going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I'm intrigued. I hope we can stay in touch, because I really like how you think. I love the pushback, because it's there's so many things that I think about, and I try to have these conversations as regularly as I can. But it's trying to evolve my perspective and understand things from a different angle, and certainly like you've given me a lot to think about in a very, in a way that I hadn't considered before. Like,
well, thank you for allowing me to push back gracefully. You were graceful with it.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's asking that.
I mean, it's nice that you don't take it personally.
Oh yeah, you're helping me ask a question from a different angle, see the question from a different angle, and then see a whole nother level of the question I could be asking. Even just the question of why. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of how do I be more personal in my work. You're looking at the why also from another depth, which is how does my work become more relevant to society? How does it reflect the values of society? And I think that is it's another level that I'm excited to really give more thought to and
Awesome.
explore. So I'm going to go just feast off of the rest of your podcasts because I enjoyed them so much.
Great.
And then hopefully we can continue the dialogue and I can stay in touch with you and
Absolutely, man.
put you in my friend list now. And if you don't mind me bothering you every once in a while.
Absolutely. This is education. I'm passionate about it,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying, oh, I'm the grand old teacher who's going to show everybody, but the dialogue is important. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. I really do. Because you're doing something that my podcast doesn't. I just spew stuff. I tell stories. But you're engaging in a way that I don't, and I appreciate that, and I value it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I just wrote you yesterday, and we put this together quickly. And
my time is my own.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm grateful to spend the time with you, and thank you for letting me record this. And just tell everybody one more time.
Yeah.
It's the Sculptor's Funeral.
Yeah, the Sculptor's Funeral podcast. I'm up to episode 92, and for those of you who have been following me, you know that I haven't put an episode out in about 2 years, until about 2 weeks ago. And now you know why. I took the time off to write my historical novel, which, by the way, is the first of 4. I'm writing an entire series, so now
Wow.
I'm working on the Jean-Baptiste Carpeau sequel to Rude's Awakening. So that's why I haven't put out more podcasts, but I put one out just 2 weeks ago. I'll be doing another one in a couple weeks. So you can find me all over the internet. Just Google me.
Jason Arkles.
Jason Arkles.
Is it
jasonarkles.com?
jasonarkles.com?
Yep.
Instagram.
I think it's also Jason Arkles. And the last time I posted on Instagram was it'll be about 18 months, I think.
Oh, wow.
I suck at social media, and I want to suck at social media. I don't enjoy it. It's not something I enjoy doing. If I didn't have a podcast, I probably wouldn't have a presence at all. But yeah, I'm there. I'm hanging on.
Yeah. Oh, well, I would encourage anyone. I don't have a lot of followers or whatever, but for the 15 people that listen to this, I would highly suggest his podcast. I've just found it, and it's one of my favorites. So thanks again. And
thank you.
That's it.
All right.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, man. It was a good time.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.